What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Today, in episode 13 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast, I'm speaking with Carolyn Lukensmeyer. Carolyn is currently the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organisation in the United States that works to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in the political system. As a leader in the field of deliberative democracy, Carolyn works to restore the US's democracy to reflect the intended vision of their founding fathers. Dr. Lukensmeyer founded and was for many years the President of AmericaSpeaks, an award-winning non-profit organisation that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage citizens and leaders through the development of innovative public policy tools and strategies. Thank you for joining me today, Carolyn. It's really great to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be with you.
So look, just to kick off, how did you get involved in this area of work? I mean, I can see from reading your bio that you've been working in this area for many, many years, but how did that happen?
Well, I'm actually going to give you a little bit of bio because I think in my case, there were a lot of things in my life that predisposed me to be in this work before I directly moved into the work. First of all, I grew up in a very large multi-generational family that held very diverse views on many things in terms of religion, politics. So I learned as a very young person how much influence you could have if you actually listen. And I think that is a skill that most people in democracies today have a very inflated view of how well they listen, when in fact they actually need to build skills in listening. So I feel very blessed that I grew up in an environment in which I learned the value of listening and held a high value on the importance of listening from a very young age. I think the second moment in my life that predisposed me to be in this kind of work was I came of age during the Vietnam War in the United States. So coming from a family that really believed in American values, that really had nothing but a positive view of the government, I found myself at the age of 18, 19, understanding that my government did not represent what I thought was the right thing to do in the world. So that understanding of a disconnect between a personal and a public view and what's the formal policy of a government became very central in my life for several years. It led for me to be very engaged as a social activist, doing lots of demonstrations. In the end, an unusual chapter in my life, I felt so deeply about this, I actually went to Vietnam in 1971. As I was in graduate school, I went as a social science researcher to try to actually get data myself on the things that the Nixon administration were saying about why they were doing what they were doing. Then I did my PhD in organization development, and what I wanted to learn was what are the differences in how decisions are made in small organizations, medium size, large size? What's the difference whether it's a public sector organization or a private sector organization? And frankly, in that same growing up, coming of age period, the second wave of feminism was alive and thriving in the United States. So I did my dissertation on the differences in gender and leadership and approach to decision making. And without going into a lot of detail, I had no political aspirations at that point, but one of my consulting contracts was with the state of Ohio to work with a team to create the first ever done in the United States of a strategic plan that was government-wide. Not each agency doing its own plan, what is the tradition, but literally here are 8 goals the governor has. What do each of the agencies have to contribute to each of those goals? In that process, the governor saw me work, and he was very much a risk taker. To make a long story short, in his second term, he invited me to be his chief of staff. which is a position which traditionally goes to someone who's very political or someone who's
Yes.
been key in fundraising. But in his first term, he had successfully passed a lot of laws that matched what he had promised voters, but things weren't changing inside the bureaucracy. So his attraction to me was my depth of skill, was how do you change large bureaucracies? Because I was in the chief of staff role, it was an extraordinary on-the-job learning experience about politics and government and how policy, politics, and management intertwine with one another and what it takes to actually get things done. So it was a wonderful experience. We made changes in Ohio that I'm very proud to say still exist today, even though there have been more governors of the other party than of his original party. So when I left that job, I think the right way to say it is I was extraordinarily optimistic about how possible it is to modify and redesign public bureaucracies. And I had the creds because of all my consulting in corporations. I could go out and make a speech that's actually easier to change public bureaucracies than private bureaucracies when these conditions exist. The other half of my speech, given the opportunity I've been given, I find myself really concerned about the state of democracy in the United States of America. I was a little bit ahead of time. I was giving this speech in 1991. But the same 10 factors that I spoke about beginning in January 91 are the same 10 factors that are the issues today, only they're worse. The amount of money in politics, the inappropriate redistricting to create congressional districts that a single party can keep for decades, the role of special interest groups, the lack of civic education for the public, so that more and more Americans are not exercising their right to vote. So these are the things that I talked about. That led me eventually to work in the Clinton-Gore administration after Bill Clinton and Al Gore were elected in November of 1992. With Al Gore, I worked on reinventing government. So my first exposure was again in this expertise I have about redesigning bureaucracies. But at the end of that work, I was invited to actually work on the chief of staff's staff inside the White House. And once I came to Washington and really saw at a national level the interlocking interests of big corporations, of Wall Street, of mass media, of special interest groups, and of actually the parties themselves, it got very clear to me that nobody in Washington was taking seriously, after the voting, what's the cornerstone of American democracy, of the people, by the people, for the people. There was no place for public voice in Washington other than through polling data. And as I imagine all your listeners are very fully aware, polling data is what a political scientist would call is a pre-political opinion. You call me on the phone, you ask me a series of yes or no questions. I'm not thinking about it in any context other than that phone call. I'm not coming up a discussion with anyone else. So it's not a stable opinion. It moves around all the time. So I left the Clinton administration in March of 1995 and founded AmericaSpeaks, which I'm very proud to say worked in all 50 states, worked in 15 other countries around the world, sometimes on public policy issues, healthcare reform, sometimes on budget allocation issues, sometimes in response to disasters. We worked in New York City after 9/11, in New Orleans after Katrina and the flooding. And the entire mission of AmericaSpeaks was to bring together a representative sample of the public to deliberate on the critical policy issue at hand and to give the people who were in a position to make a decision a collective view of the public of New York City, of the public of New Orleans. We did budget summits for Washington, D.C. We did healthcare reform in 21 states. So that's how I got into this, Nivak. That might have been more background than you were hoping for, but I think it tells a story about why I do what I do and why I care so much about it.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with these type of processes?
I'd be happy to. One of the challenges for any elected official once they're in office is it's very difficult for them to access public opinion through any other than one of two ways: polling or specific constituents who approach them on a specific issue. To get the best public policy, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote quite beautifully about this in the founding of our republic, where he said the best public policy will come from connecting the knowledge of experts and the wisdom of ordinary people living their daily lives. And what the deliberation process with minipublics can do is create a meaningful set of comments, content, data that brings the wisdom of the public to the table to match the importance of expert knowledge. So the outcome of many public deliberations is an essential asset to elected officials. Many elected officials do not yet understand that.
No.
Mostly because they've not had a positive experience or any experience. Most elected officials' experience are in traditional public meetings, which are designed very poorly, which only bring out what we in the United States call the usual suspects, the same people complaining about the same issue month after month after month. So over time, the public officials build up a negative attitude toward the public. The public already has a negative attitude toward the public officials. So another very positive outcome of the deliberative minipublics is a new experience. Who are we as the public? Who are we as the public officials? And who are we when we are together in a designed, created environment that is productive?
Yes, and I think that's the experience of most of the people I've spoken to date for the podcast, and my personal experience here in Australia. It makes quite a difference. And that point you were making is one that's coming up a lot, is the lack of trust that people have in government. But the concept that the government has a lack of trust in people is also something that is being mentioned more and more, and using a range of processes to change that. So I know you've worked on a range of deliberative processes, and I'm wondering if you could describe a couple of these and tell us about what the outcomes were from the processes.
Well, AmericaSpeaks did more than 200 projects in the 18 years that I led the organization. And the range of topics and issues that we took on was huge. I think some of our signature projects that more people know about: after 9/11 in New York, there were huge decisions to be made about the rebuilding of the site. How tall should the buildings be? What kind of investment should go into transportation? Should more go into the subway system, to ferries, bringing people even from New Jersey into New York, into railways out to Long Island? There was not going to be enough money to do everything, so the decisions had to be made about how to allocate those resources. So AmericaSpeaks' responsibility, we designed a process called Listening to the City, and we brought together 5,000 people who gathered at the Jacob Javits Center in July of 2011.
That's an incredible number of people.
It was incredible, and it was extraordinary. In a disaster situation, when you're bringing in a representative public, some people are still completely caught up in grief and needing to heal. Some other people whose lives were a little less impacted directly are ready to move straight ahead with rebuilding. So you have to design an agenda that makes the space and holds the container that no matter what each human being's experience is, they feel respected and listened to. We were delighted with the response in New York. At the end of the day, the governor's primary representative came to the stage and said, "We've heard the public. We understand that the basic design principles that we started with will have to be revised. The public has basically rejected all of them." So they took the data out of the public discussions, which because of the way we use computers and voting devices, we could actually at the end of the day say of the 5,000 people, these are our top priorities. These are the criteria we want you to use for rebuilding. And based on that data, the authorities, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, wrote an RFP, a request for proposals, that they then disseminated worldwide. And if you took the data in that RFP and compared it to the results out of listening to the city, you would see where literally the issues around New Yorkers did not want the buildings, the skyscrapers, to go above the level of floor, I've forgotten the number, it's too many years ago, that we know is safe if in fact there is some kind of mechanical breakdown, electrical breakdown, or God forbid, another kind of tragedy. So that was confirmed. And the designs that came back, no building that has been rebuilt at the Lower Manhattan site is higher than that number of floors. But because of a sense of pride and a sense of design, some of the buildings have a design feature that goes higher, and they're very beautiful, but they're not occupied.
It's very interesting to me how you actually work a room of 1,000 people or 5,000 people. Could you briefly just take us through how you structured the event with that many people to make it actually work?
I'd be happy to. And frankly, we're very proud. AmericaSpeaks worked with many organizations connected to the European Union, so I'm certain that you would see what I'm about to describe, you would see replicated in what you are describing has been now done in several European countries and done for the EU across countries several times. So imagine walking into a convention center, a large open room. And I'll take the New York example since we're talking about it. So it was 5,000 people. So when you walked in the room, what you saw was a room that had 500 round tables, each of which could seat 10 participants and a facilitator, someone who's very skilled in deliberation, who understands how to move out of conflict, who understands how to keep the extroverts from dominating, who understands how to bring introverts into the conversation, and sometimes has to have cultural training. And in New York, that was very important. As most of your listeners would understand, the issue particularly of Muslim women speaking in front of Muslim men in a public space was an issue. So we were very careful that no Muslim women were seated at a table with Muslim men, but they were seated at a table with other people. And their opportunity to speak, if they weren't comfortable initiating themselves, was created by the table facilitator. So most of the dialogue goes on amongst those 10 people, so it's very authentic. They get connected. In fact, for several years, some table participants out of New York, they took each other's email addresses, phone numbers. For some number of years after that event, they continued to talk together. So each of the tables also has a wireless laptop computer. Now we just use iPads. All of those iPads are connected to a central computing function. So at each table, let's say, I don't any longer remember what the first question was in New York, but frankly, we always ask first a values question or a vision question. In New Orleans, I happened to, after Katrina and the flooding, for some reason it just popped into my mind. The very first thing we did at the tables of 10 was every table had a map of New Orleans right on the table. And as people introduced themselves, we asked them to say, show your neighbors where your home was in New Orleans prior to the flooding. And then the question that we asked is, what do you love most about New Orleans? And what do you miss most about New Orleans? And as you can imagine, that really connected people's hearts and heads. It put a glue on at the tables in terms of empathy and openness to some people didn't lose their homes. Most did. But it equalized the table in terms of a sense of creating a small community to look at these issues. So as people are saying that, the computer operator, which is always a citizen who volunteers, is typing into the computer. This is what our table said are the things we love most about New Orleans. These are the things that we miss most about New Orleans. And all of those are being fed to couple other tables in the room right then and there, where people who we call the theme team are reading those comments. And again, in New Orleans, we had 3,500 people. But always you're getting hundreds of comments, but they fall into themes. Any social science researcher has seen this out of interviews. After you do many interviews on the same questions, they begin to fall into categories. Usually when you got that many people, it's 15 to 20 categories. So when we're finished with that, the theme team needs a little time to process it. The table goes on to the next question. The theme team puts the material together, and then at the right moment in the agenda, we flash up on the screen. Here are the primary things the 3,500 of you said you love about New Orleans. So at that moment, you have created a wonderful sense of trust and credibility between the table conversations and this large room of 3,500 people or 5,000 people. Or frankly, sometimes we did it like when we did healthcare reform in California. We had people located in 8 different cities across that huge state. And we linked them by webcast so they could see each other's cities, but all the data went to one central place. So I'm standing in Sacramento reading the themes about whether or not the public thought pre-existing conditions should be required by healthcare companies for insurance. And immediately the whole of California, distributed across those thousands of miles, could see that the core of the group felt the same way.
That's incredible.
So you go from table conversations, you use computers to organize the data, you present it back, and then when necessary, like when you're at the policy issues, every single person has a little keypad devoting device that now is about the size of a credit card. And then you put the options up on the screen. If number 1 is your choice, that's what you vote for. So I might be at a table that felt investing in education was the highest priority, but in my hearts of hearts, I still really felt it should be safety. So in the end, even though my table's majority went one way, I still have another time as an individual to add my vote to any other tables that might have picked safety as the top priority. So you can see the move from the tables to the plenary is totally transparent. People see their own words on the screen, so their confidence in the credibility of it, the trust is built. This is our meeting and we are making decisions collectively. The work to put together to get the right people in the room, to get the right questions, it's back-breaking work. But I did it for 18 years, and I want to tell you that every time we did it, watching those Americans struggle with those issues, or watching those Europeans from 25 countries on the ethics of brain science, seeing them finally, they didn't speak the same language even, seeing them watch their data come alive, see what the collective decision is, and put their stamp of approval on, yes, we believe this is what the government should do.
That's just amazing. What do you see as the difference between traditional citizens' engagement and deliberative mini-publics?
Well, again, I know more about the traditional processes in my own country than I do in other countries. In the United States, that has typically been what are called public hearings. And in contrast to what I just described, a public hearing is usually held in an auditorium. So people are all in seats facing a dais where the officials are sitting on a raised platform. There's a couple of microphones in the aisles. The public officials make their introduction, they ask their question, and people line up behind the microphones and get 1 minute to talk or 2 minutes to talk. So it becomes very repetitive. Let's say there's 300 people in the room, it's an hour long, probably only 20 people get to talk. So there's nothing collective about it. There's nothing that the public feels identified with each other, and it becomes more of a combative situation between the people standing behind the microphones and the officials at the front of the room. The officials sometimes get defensive. The officials sometimes are clearly not even listening. So everybody's experience of most of those traditional forms is pretty unproductive and dissatisfying.
Carolyn, I know you're working on a new project called Creating Community Solutions at the moment. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'd be happy to. This came about because, as you well know, and the contrast between your country and my country is dramatic here. The first time you had a mass shooting, you passed federal legislations for serious gun control, and you don't have them now. We happen to have a completely illogical, I don't even know what word to use, but the bottom line is we have mass shootings on a regular basis. After the slaughter of innocent kids in Newtown, Connecticut, in fact, interesting, we're talking on a day, Nivek, today is the anniversary of that tragedy. And I was asked, because of my work at America Speaks, to lead a national discussion on mental health, particularly the challenges that young people face. And in the United States, all of the deliberative organizations have been continuing to try to push the window on how do we get more and more people engaged in a meaningful discussion on a big national issue, not necessarily on the same day like America Speaks worked, but to take it to many, many communities in the country. So we had 3 strategies in creating community solutions. The first was in what we call lead cities. We did do America Speaks style meetings or Everyday Democracy style meetings, which is another deliberative group, or national issues forums. And the size was about 400 to 500 people with, in fact, a true representative sample. We wanted to get to as many communities as we could, so we took advantage of the internet. We created a website called Creating Community Solutions, and every tool that we created for these lead cities, a discussion guide, fact sheets, an organizing guide, how do you get the audience into the room, an outreach guide, a design. We started with saying that people were going to talk to each other for 6 or 7 hours. Once we had that in place and understood how it worked, we then did a design for 4 hours, for 3 hours, for 2 hours, for 1 hour. So you might be a church group and you decide to meet 1 hour each week for 6 weeks. Or you might be a classroom in a high school and you decide to meet for just 1 week. So we made it as easy as we could. And then we provided coaching. We did webinars to train table facilitators to keep it neutral and to keep people on track. And 290 plus communities in the United States use those tools to come to action steps without any other help from our core group. And the last initiative that we did, which I talked about and demonstrated when I was with you all in Perth at
Yes,
the
I remember that.
IAP2. So it was called Text Talk Act, and we created a text platform connected to small group discussion because we did not want young people to be just with their device. We wanted them to be interacting with other people. We had assumed we would pull an end to that program actually last spring. But young people around the country have found it so valuable that they have actually lobbied us to keep it going. So we're going to continue the mental health discussion on Text Talk Act through next year. As of now, more than 80,000 young people have used this process. We know it's prevented from suicides. We know that it has brought mental health first aid training into many schools around the country, not just for the students, but for teachers as well. I think elements that people who want to extend the conversation to a larger number of people might find valuable in looking at our website, or I can send you the book we actually wrote about this, which you could then put on your site and people could go to it. It's called Creating Community Solutions, Out of the Shadows into the Light.
That sounds fantastic. Yes, I could put that on the website with the show notes for this episode. And so nice to use the mobile technology with young people, just such a clever way.
And as you would understand, the platform itself is issue neutral. So we used it to call Text Talk Vote during the 2016 election to encourage millennials to vote. And given the toxicity and tremendously degrading tone of the U.S. presidential election, we have now transformed it to be Text Talk Revive Civility. And throughout 2017, we'll be using it in communities all across the country to try to bring back the social norm of civil behavior, respectful behavior, and see if we can't pull back the kind of bigoted language and, frankly, some violent behavior that was made legitimate by how our candidates behave. Tragically.
Yes, it's a very unusual situation I think America finds itself in now, and we all just watch from a distance and wonder. In your experience, are there downsides or limitations to the use of deliberative mini-publics?
That's a great question. And I think from my perspective, the most significant downside still currently is the lack of understanding, both on the side of public officials and the public itself, of how valuable this is and how much it can add to quality decision making. I actually think that's the biggest downside. Again, it's probably different. You have more examples in Australia of the government itself adopting the mini-publics. The things the city of Melbourne did on budgeting are very impressive. Things that were done in Western Australia on regional planning. So in the U.S., another downside is that the costs of doing this somehow have to be absorbed across the private and public sector because it's not been worked into public budgeting. I think in that regard, you're ahead of us in Australia, that there is an acceptance and an understanding that this isn't a legitimate expenditure of tax dollars.
That's definitely the case. I mean, it is an expensive business no matter how you look at it, but we've really gotten to the stage where generally most of the processes are commissioned by government, and they recognise that by doing that they have to cover the costs. I think we've got a very strong tradition of community engagement, and that costs money. So it's really about sort of saying, well, we always spent money to hear from the community. This is a little bit more expensive, perhaps sometimes a lot more expensive, but it's worthwhile. And one of the things that's interesting here is that they're because of that tradition and often legislative requirements around consultation, a lot of agencies are sequencing. They'll do broad, what you might call participatory outreach, different processes, and then they'll feed the outcomes of that into a deliberative process, which is what they did with the Melbourne People's Panel. They fed a broad consultation, and the people on the panel looked at that and took it into account with their considerations. So yeah, very interesting. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Carolyn's work with AmericaSpeaks and the National Institute for Civil Discourse. In next week's episode, we'll be learning about the G1000, from its roots in Belgium to its extension into the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.